Hello and welcome back to Modern Education. I'm the host of Modern Education, Benjamin S. Woodford, here on 90.1 KZSU Stanford. I'm back in the studio with my co-host, Emily Quiles.
Hello.
We are
happy Friday.
Yes, happy Friday. It is always a happy Friday for us here on Modern Education because we are here every Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. for your commute home. We are on 90.1 FM on KZSU Stanford, and we are also streaming online across the world. And we have had people tuning in from Russia to China to Texas and all in between. And we are so excited to have you back with us for another exciting episode of Modern Education. We've got a guest here virtually in the studio with us who I'm sure you're going to enjoy. Is going to be a lot of fun for us. But first, Emily, what is going on with you today? What is on your mind in the world of modern education?
What's going on? Well, I've just finished up my preschool. My little preschoolers graduated on Wednesday, and it was probably one of the cutest things ever. They were singing songs.
Did they have little gowns?
They just had the little hats, and they threw them up, and it was really cute.
That's adorable. Yeah. So what? They're 6 years old?
5.
5 years old.
Yeah.
Oh my
4
gosh.
to 5, yeah. So
45 years old?
4 to 5.
These are some old kids.
45
that makes me still a kid if that's the case. Okay.
But yeah, so now the teachers were all in the mode of cleaning up, organizing.
Okay.
So,
it's like ready to just go home and be done and get ready for next year.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think on my mind.
I think I have all kinds of teacher friends and teachers in my social media feed. And they're just it's like my whole life is surrounded by teaching and educators. And it's a little awesome because they are the best kind of people in the world. If you're really looking for someone to be a good friend a teacher.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be good for you. Yeah.
Exactly.
But I'm seeing all these posts on social media where some teachers are like, yes, I'm getting ready for next year. This is going to be awesome. And others are like, how are these overachievers getting ready for next year? I'm just trying to survive the end of this year still.
Yeah. No, we're just doing the cleaning. It's not really getting ready. It's just putting everything back where it belongs. And it is not fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always good to have a reset. And I think that is one of the beautiful things about the way our school system works, although I don't think it's all beautiful. But the idea of getting a little time off, getting a reset, getting a chance to start anew instead of just going forever, which is what working people do, right? They just keep working. It's like, take a couple days off, go right back to work. It never ends. Yeah. So I think at the very least, school has that figured out, and maybe Google should take some initiative to get closer to what the school system is doing and give their employees 3 months off a year. I mean, why not, right? Who wants to really work year round anyway? Okay, I am getting off topic. We do that. So we're going to let's bring our guest on here in a minute. I'm going to first introduce our guest. Our guest today is Ann Lay. She's a second-year doctoral student in the Educational Leadership Program at Sam Houston State University in Texas. She holds a Texas teacher certification in special education, a master's degree in special education, and a Texas certification as an educational diagnostician, which we will tell you what that means soon enough today. Let's see. Other than that, Ann also currently serves as an educational diagnostician and does evaluation as a consultant to Texas-wide school districts in the assessment of Vietnamese students with suspected disabilities. The focus of her current research is on applications of leadership in special education. Now, Ann is going to come here on the line. Ann, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And you're going to have to excuse my voice. I lost it last night.
Well, we are just glad that we're making this work because we've been really looking forward to getting you in the studio. Obviously, you are virtually in the studio coming from Texas. You're calling in right now. So, it's awesome that we have the capability to do that, and we're really happy to have you here. This is amazing.
Thank you.
So, Ann, we're just going to jump right into this because we only have an hour and it goes by so fast, and I want to pick your brain for everything we can for the next hour, okay? Okay, now, I think it's really important to help our listeners get a handle on kind of where you got into this. I mean, I think disability is not necessarily something that most people are familiar with, and not necessarily something people think to go into supporting that segment of society, even if roughly 1/5 of people in our society have some sort of a disability. So it is I think the way I read it was the largest minority group in the country. So it seems a little funny that would be something that people don't generally think of. But with that in mind, I'm just curious, before you got into, just studying your PhD work here and actually working within that industry and education, how did you get exposed to this and how did this come about for you to become a passion that you follow?
Well, I speak to a lot of teachers and related service members who work in special education, and majority of the time they started with some sort of event or family member that has a disability. And in my case, I have a younger brother. He's now 30 years old. He was born with a lot of disabilities and he developed a lot along the way. And I was only 6 years old at the time. And to be honest, I wasn't a very social person. And I took on the role of that maternal instinct and I took care of him. And I made sure that, he was getting everything he needed because my parents didn't really speak any English.
Wow.
So as he enrolled into school, back then everything was segregated. So they had self-contained classrooms. They were viewed differently. And so they were separated from all the other students in school. And so I kind of firsthand saw like the evolution of special education as a family member.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And do you have any headphones handy, by the way? I'm getting a little feedback I think when I speak. Do you happen to have headphones handy? No, that's okay. Keep going. We're fine. We're fine. That's fine. Okay. Sorry to cut you off. So
you're fine.
Yeah. So continue, please.
Okay. So, and so at a young age, I worked with a lot of his therapists, and I would always ask questions because I was so inquisitive, even as a young child. And I always have this need to just know more so that I could do more. And so that just carried on.
A born researcher, huh?
Yeah, sounds like it.
I was born to do this.
Yeah.
And so that's how I got started. And I just saw how his friends were interacting and how much potential and how much that they can do that other people just really don't see.
Right.
They always compare, these individuals to, I say regular, but non-disabled individuals. And we have to view them differently because they have needs and, they have their strengths and they have their weaknesses.
Sure. Like all of us, really. It's just maybe different domains or different levels of severity, right?
Yeah. And so, and I graduated high school. I went to Baylor University. I studied neuroscience, pre-law and pre-med. And I really had an interest in behavioral neuroscience. And really it's, understanding the nervous system and related disorders. And this really helped a lot because it explains the biological factors to disorders such as autism. And as a diagnostician, I help programming with students with disabilities, with all sorts of disabilities.
Right. So do you feel like this neuroscience background gave you a different perspective into how you think about people's disabilities or the neurological effects?
I think so, because one of the components of my studies when I did neuroscience was test trying behaviors and reinforcements, negative and positive reinforcement. And so there's a component to that. And being a teacher, we see that in students. Students, they work well with positive reinforcement, and it's understanding and reading their nonverbal and their verbal cues to be able to work with them, learn how they learn and using the styles that they learn and just approaching it that way.
Yeah. And I think that's a really great point to kind of bring out, especially because we're really hoping to get parents maybe through this episode armed with some ideas about how they can approach getting services or understanding how that works for them. It's not our only goal, but it's definitely something we'd like people to take away. And I think there's a really important distinction here between getting like a medical diagnosis and getting, services put in place within schools, because my understanding is they're first not the same thing. A medical diagnosis will not get you the services you need in school directly.
And yes, and that is a very good point that you had made, because I just recently did a journal article. It's under peer review at this time, and it discusses medical diagnosis and educational need. And a lot of the times, and that's one of the components that is difficult in the school setting, because I have a lot of parents who come to me and they'll tell me, well, my child has a medical diagnosis. Yes, there's a medical diagnosis, but we have to look at the educational factor of it.
Right.
Special education is providing students with access to the curriculum, and access is the key word there. And if their medical condition is not impacting the way that they access their curriculum, their academic task or their functional task, there is no need for special education. And parents can go about different routes, such as Section 504, but special education is so restricted that we want to make sure that we're putting students in placements that are appropriate.
Sure. And this is the piece that I believe that the term is the non-discriminatory multidisciplinary diagnostic evaluation. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the idea. So you put together my understanding, at least, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you put together a team of people from different areas of maybe a social worker and a counselor or therapist, a diagnostician like yourself, probably a teacher, maybe the principal, the special ed teacher, all of this kind of stuff, right? And so the idea with that is actually, my understanding, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is we're trying to create a educationally based assessment that is not just grounded to a medical diagnosis, which may or may not be helpful for the educational setting.
Is it to say that basically a medical diagnostic doesn't really have much ground, that it's just you have this and that's it?
Well, there's Anne, can you speak to that a little better? I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that.
Okay, so the one thing that pops up into my head is ADHD. ADHD is it. The diagnosis of ADHD has increased a lot lately, and and I'm going to go off on a tangent later on about how I have seen, the increase of technology and things like that would affect a student's ability to focus and attend to tasks and things like that. But
yeah, I think that's affecting me with my smartphone right now, and I'm like arguably at least halfway intelligent. So, so I can only imagine what it does to kids of any level or developmental ability. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when we look at ADHD diagnosis, first off, when students are referred for special education evaluation, sometimes it's best that there is a committee within the school to go over all those results prior to being referred for special education, because you can't just refer for special education because you think something is wrong. There has to be a suspected disability. We typically should not ask for all areas. And I'm saying I cringe when I get a referral where I'm testing for autism, intellectual disabilities, civic learning disability, ADHD, speech impairment. I'm talking about everything. And I come back and I'm like, okay, so what is suspected disability? And they will tell me, well, the kid's not doing well in school, so just test for everything.
And that's not really the goal, though, right? I mean, the goal is to figure out what they actually need as support to be able to participate in the educational system, right?
Exactly. It's kind of like going to the doctor. You go to the doctor because you have symptoms. You tell the doctor what the symptoms are, and the doctor will go down his evaluation, his knowledge, and then, he makes a determination based on what you say. You can't just go to the doctor and say, I think I'm sick. I don't know what's wrong with me. You tell me.
Right. And more so, it's not that the doctor's diagnosis and the name he gives it is really all that important. It is how much the treatment alleviates the symptoms or leads towards healing, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important way to think about providing services for children who may have a disability or maybe even just struggling in school. Is every kid has something that is stopping them from being the most successful that they can be. And this process of diagnosing that seems to be a process of figuring out how to best support the child. And that is like the reasoning behind it. Is that accurate?
Yes. And so when we assess for ADHD, if the students are not under Section 504 at that time, now the bottom line is when you need special education, it the results should indicate that there needs to be a change in the way that his education or her education is provided to her. If they don't need any changes, such as in-class support, that's providing them an additional paraprofessional that is in the classroom to help, maintain the task of focus and things like that.
Right.
If all they need is a couple accommodations, such as, frequent breaks, reminders to stay on task, small group administration, things like that, they can get that support through Section 504.
Right. So that's different than an IEP, right? It's a different level of support.
Right.
Right.
And we always want to make sure that it is the main word is least restrictive environment.
Right. That's the acronym's LRE, right? And that's something that'll get thrown around a lot. The least restrictive environment. Can you just define that for our folks at home?
So the least restrictive environment, when we look at a child who is receiving special education services or not, we want to look at making sure that any removal of a child from the general classroom is to benefit the child and not hinder the child. And this goes back in the old days when students who had, disabilities being placed in a segregated classroom.
Right.
That necessarily isn't the least restrictive environment, especially if all that child has is physical disabilities and, they're unable to just accommodate for that. Removing them is not going to be the least restrictive environment. We always want to work towards an inclusive education. And this isn't a very black and white, situation here, because we have to look at, the individual child's needs, but also the collective whole. Sometimes a student will exhibit a lot of behavioral characteristics that will interfere with the education of other students.
Sure.
And so that's when we have to look at, what is best for that child, but also what is best for the other children.
Sure. And there's even in the adult, I guess, disability world, people have been being put into asylums and things like this for a long time. And there's a big push now to actually get rid of these and kind of integrate people back into society. And I think, at least back to the school setting, when you put a whole bunch of kids that are struggling in one room together and it's just them and that's all they have to look to, there becomes a sort of like a domino effect where you're essentially imitating the behaviors you're seeing, which is how all humans learn. So it's completely expected. And
that's exactly what it is. It's students children and adults, we learn through social interaction with other peers. When they're segregated, their role models are limited. Their role models are students who have disabilities or adults who have disabilities, and especially students who have autism or adults who have autism. They're going to mimic the behaviors that they see. So that's why there's a big push for inclusive education, because it's not about just academic. It's not about, grades and things like that. It's also functioning skills.
Sure.
We want to prepare these students to be independent individuals, to, make a impact in the community. We don't want them to, just sit back after they graduate from high school and what are they supposed to do? If we did not put in place instructions or strategies or lessons to help them integrate themselves into the community.
Right. And so there's essentially an expectation that is how we are going to do this. It's called the free and appropriate public education is this idea. FAPE is the acronym again, but the idea is that an appropriate public education means getting the best possible outcomes we can for these kids and not necessarily, just pigeonholing them into a place that they can't get out of. And it's hard to say that, you can't really guarantee that all these kids are really going to become functioning, contributing members of society in the traditional sense, right? Some of these kids are going to get through school and have a very limited way to be able to contribute, or maybe just need care their whole lives. But there's large degrees of difference between care your whole life and having no ability to have autonomy at all because you had no life. Yeah. And I think, your brother, a lot of kids who have supportive families, they end up getting a lot more capability and a lot more functioning because of the supports that are put in place and the educational experiences afforded to them. And when kids aren't getting that, it can be hugely detrimental.
Right. And what I also see is, my brother, unfortunately, he has a sister like me.
Or fortunately.
I'm a very pushy person, and I have very high expectations for him.
Mm-hmm.
And as an educator, I feel that we need to have high expectations even for students with disability, because we don't want to give them a
especially, right?
Yeah. And we want them to be accountable for what they can't be accountable for. And so it's hard because we see, as parents, we see our kids struggling and we want to do everything we can to help them. But at the same time, you think about, are we giving them too much? And then it's a learned helplessness at that point, because by the time they get into middle school and high school, they've been given so much support and not enough room to grow and be independent. And so, it's difficult for my brother now because when I went to college at Baylor, he had that 4 years where he didn't have any expectations. And so by the time I got home, he just expected everybody to pick things up for him and put things where it needs to be until, I kind of laid down the hammer again with him.
Was there a lot of loss in functionality while you were gone that you had to you felt responsible to pick up the pieces for?
I feel very guilty. This is a personal thing for me. I feel very guilty for the diminishing functionality of my brother. Before I left for college, he could walk. Mm-hmm. Even though he's hemiplegic, he was able to have a gait trainer, a walker, and he was able to walk with that.
Right.
Now, he always had, someone close by to him, but at least he could get from here to there slowly, but it was working his muscles and everything like that. Mm-hmm. When I left, nobody was forcing that. I love my parents to death, but in our culture, we do everything for our children.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of cultural aspect to it, but
can we talk about that a little bit as far as what is the cultural perception of disability? Yeah. We're talking about your Vietnamese background in a community in Texas where there's a lot of people from Vietnam there, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about what the perception is of disability within that community or how it's treated.
So disabilities, unless an individual is physically disabled, they're not considered for special education or anything like that. And when they have a physical disability, majority of the time, they don't go to school. There's no real regulation to going to school in Vietnam. And so when a family has a individual who has disability, majority of the time, that individual stays home and the parent cares for them. So they have no school.
You're talking about in Vietnam, that's generally
Vietnam,
so
yes.
That's not legal here, right?
No, it's not legal
so
here.
What does that look like in the Vietnamese community when you get stateside?
When you get here, our beliefs still carry over in the United States. I know there are a lot of families who have changed that aspect, but a lot of, old habits die hard. Yeah. And we have a lot of old school, parents still. Disability is viewed as bad luck in our culture. And there's a certain stigma that goes with that. We believe a majority of the country, we are Buddhist, and the Buddhist way is that we believe in reincarnation. And so when we view disability, the idea is that family member, the parent, must have done something wrong in their previous life. So they now have a child who has disabilities. And so that's the mentality of it. I know a lot of people may not understand it, but our culture is different. We all have different beliefs, but that's the basis of it. And so
sure. And that's wow, that's a tough one, right? Because how do you, first of all, there must be huge amounts of guilt implicit in that for the parent when there's a child who's having a hard time, and then the culture and society is saying, oh, this is your fault for something you didn't even do in this lifetime, perhaps, right? And
putting the pressure on a whole new level.
Yeah. And I think for anyone in any context, it is a challenge to care for a child that has even full functioning. And then when you start talking about introducing, things as simple as needing assistance with toileting or diapers or something like that for a whole life of a person instead of for a couple years where they're an infant. I mean, that creates a stress that is over and beyond just regular parenting. And then to create the social stigma to go along with that is truly heartbreaking in my mind to think. Yeah, go ahead.
And my parents, our family was the social family in our community here in Houston, Texas. And, when my little brother was born, they had to make a decision because a lot of the friends that we had kind of started shying away because of stigma. And they didn't want to be associated with us because they felt that if they were, then they would get some bad luck or bad juju or something.
Wow, the contagion of karma, perhaps, right?
And so I'm very happy that my parents chose, family over anything else. But it was hard for them because they were such a social family. We were the family that everybody comes to.
Wow. Yeah.
Gatherings and things like that. And now it's just them and us kind of thing.
Wow. Yeah, that's rough. And it shouldn't definitely not be that way. And yet it is. And in the midst of all that, it seems like your family and you have made lemonade from lemons. Is that how the saying goes?
You made a lot. You put something that could have been easily a negative into a positive, and you've completely shaped your career around it.
So speaking of your career, you mentioned a few minutes ago, you have an article under peer review right now. You're working and researching and serving the community as a diagnostician as well. But I'm just curious, can you tell us a little bit about what you're researching right now and what you're working on? I'd love to get that out there.
Yes.
I am constantly working on something. Like I said, I have a need to know more because I feel like the more knowledge you have, the better you can serve, others. And I've always just wanted to know more. I've done a lot of personal research on learning disabilities. That one's published out. I have an article out that talks specifically about assessing students who are of Vietnamese descent, because there's a lot of cultural and linguistic considerations that come to it. And so at my current campus that I'm at, or my district, I do serve as a consult to make sure that the assessments are appropriate and considering, the cultural aspect of it. And I do language sampling and proficiency for Vietnamese students and families as well, and also for Texas-wide school district.
What are some of the challenges with the language barrier and a disability kind of being combined, the intersection between that? How does that come into play in your work? So there's a lot of linguistic consideration and cultural consideration. With linguistic, I think the misconception is that these families come here to America and their first language is Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. And they're put into a school and expected to pick up on a second language, English, and then do that with proficiency. But the problem with that is everyone thinks that the English language is very simple, but it's not, because the spelling rules change, the way that it's just, there's no definite rules. In Vietnam, there are strict rules to how you learn to write, to read. It's done by accent marks and things like that. So teachers, they don't have a lot of time to sit and wait and learn with the child. And I'm not saying anything about teachers. They have a lot of stuff on their plate. We're big fans of teachers around here, but they also are not perfect. We're all human, right?
Exactly. And so I'm not saying anything wrong about the teachers. It's just, we just have to remember to take a step back and realize that these people are learning two different languages. Now, talking about cultural aspect of it, a lot of teachers will misunderstand certain cues that children will exhibit. And I hear a lot of complaints about how parents are not involved. Well, the problem with that is, in Vietnam, they're used to the teachers leading everything. Parents
there's a sort of cultural deference in a lot of Asian countries towards teachers, right?
Right. Teachers hold higher status than doctors in our country. And so
I like
they
that. That's great.
Sounds really nice.
Right?
Wow.
And so they never want to challenge a teacher or question a teacher because that's their profession and that's they're expected to do their job, so they're not going to interfere. And so when I'm in schools here, I hear a lot of teachers say, well, they never come to teacher conferences or they never answer my phone. Well, they don't want to challenge. I mean, they're not going to fight back. You can tell them, how their child's doing, and they're just going to say yes.
Right.
Not.
So I'm going to kind of take us out of order in the questions. I know you might be expecting another question here, but I'm going to throw something different at you here. What do you think about just the deference to authority, or even just lack of knowledge that certain minority groups, I mean, maybe Vietnamese, maybe other minority groups, have going into school systems and meetings and IEP setups and all these kind of things? How do you think maybe lack of understanding of how the system works affects parents' ability to support or kids' ability to get the right kind of resources given to them in these situations?
There's always going to be outliers in every situation, but the majority of, the parents that I do know, they come from low SES, society, and they're not as educated. And so they will go along with anything that the teacher recommends. And that's where we have to take a step back and say, is this a language disorder or is this a language difference? I mean, do they need more time to work on these skills, or is there really a disability? And so there has to be a lot of discussion on that before you do a referral, because I can tell you the 4 years that I've been a diagnostician in my district, I have never qualified a child with who is Vietnamese with a disorder, because majority of the time it's just a language.
Wow. Yeah.
It's a language barrier, and parents, especially some of the parents I know, don't speak English, and so there's that language barrier. So that's why it's very important to have interpreters, and not a lot of educators will think about that, because the parents appear to understand, but the big thing is Vietnamese culture, we say yes to everything.
Right.
And so they're nodding their head and they're saying yes, 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 but really they don't understand.
I'm nodding my head right now. I'm still not sure if I understand. Yeah. So, okay. So I'm going to just kind of take us in a slightly different direction. Just thinking about students getting services. Are these services really to fix the student, or are we trying to give them more tools to be able to satisfy their own needs or self-advocate, or is there a mix of that? What is the actual things you're giving these students as accommodations usually?
And I will tell you, it varies by the campus you're at.
Sure.
It varies by the district you're at. I've worked on campuses where they have thorough discussion about where the child's weaknesses are, how their disability impacts their education, and we put in support and accommodations that are appropriate. I've worked at different campuses that will not individualize the educational programming, which is the purpose of special education, but more of putting a drop-down box and just checking whatever accommodations that is available. The one thing that sticks out to me is when we provide oral administration. Typically, oral administration is for students who have a difficult time reading and they have a learning disability in the area of reading.
Like and dyslexia, would that be an example of that?
Dyslexia, yeah. Or, just a specific learning disability in basic reading skills.
Okay. So maybe a grapheme, phoneme kind of matching problem, or who knows? I don't know yet.
Right.
Okay.
And so in those instances, those students would benefit from oral administration because we're trying to, when we're assessing for reading comprehension, we don't want to mark down for a student who is unable to read when we're testing for reading comprehension. So the oral administration is here, so that the student can understand the story and can hear the story, so that they're able to answer the comprehension questions. Now, a lot of times we have staffings before IEP meetings, which is the meetings with parents to discuss their educational programming. And I'll hear teachers say, well, we need oral administration, but this child doesn't even have a disability in reading, and they're reading on level with all their grade level peers. So, I would ask them, well, what's the justification for that? And they'll tell me, well, they'll benefit from it. Well, the problem is everybody benefits from oral administration. If you had somebody reading your textbook for you and you didn't have to read, do you think that's going to be better? Yes.
Sure, but it doesn't exactly set a high expectation, which allows the kid to grow into new skills, right?
Yes. And so we're not helping them self-advocate for themselves. We're not helping them by being independent. We're putting a crutch on these kids, and they're going to have this learned helplessness to where they expect someone to always be there to help them and let them, just sit back while someone else does all the heavy work.
Yeah. And I think it's maybe important to be thinking about how school leadership and principals and the people who are sort of higher up within the hierarchy play a role in this. And I think that's part of what your research is doing, right?
Yes.
So can you help us understand a little better your approach to how school leadership plays into assisting students with disabilities?
Well, my research right now, the way that it's going, the direction that it's going right now is I want to look at how formal special education training affects or impacts the success of special education programming. We have
Is there much special education training in public school teacher or administrator preparation?
No, the state of Texas, most of their approved administrative prep programs, some have one class that has special education topics in there, but they're usually meshed in with bilingual ESL. So special populations have a wide range of topics. And when one course is required or not required, because there are programs out there to prepare principals who don't even require special education. And so we're already forming leaders who have a gap, when they're expected to be able to lead all programmings on their campus. And so special education, especially with the legal matters that are, linked to them, I think it's very important that more courses are required, and specific courses, not just talking about the laws and things like that. Anybody can read about the history. And so I think part of it is they try to alleviate the gap by providing professional development and training after they become principals. But, time is a factor, funding is a factor. And
there's something also to be said about stepping into this role for the first time. If you're not prepared to do it, you can start building these sort of expectations and habits around how you deal with these problems. And if you're not equipped to do it in the beginning, you may never actually fully take that on. And I think this is, the situation where principals will start delegating down the line and just sending the responsibility to other people. And I know that's something you're interested in as well. Do you want to speak on that at all?
Well, I worked on a lot of campuses where, I understand the amount of work and responsibilities that are involved with being a principal. I mean, to be honest, I'm in the principal preparation program right now. So I would want to be a principal, but it's a leadership position that, I'm trying to understand how they're prepared. But yes, most of the time, principals have so much on their plate that they do delegate to the assistant principals or their counselors to attend the IEP meetings and to attend these staffings or, take on the role of managing certain SPED students in their grade level. But when situations arise to the level of, advocates are involved, lawyers are involved, then the principal comes in. But then she doesn't know the background of all these students or the proceedings before that to understand what is really happening. And so you can't make a decision when you don't understand, how it got to be a problem.
Right. And this is, I think, necessary at any level of leadership. Is you can't steer a ship if you don't know what the people are doing on the ship, right? You can't understand how to run an organization if you're not, keeping your ear to the ground, so to speak, in that organization. And it sounds like you're sort of bringing up this idea that it is just very important to stay connected to what's happening in the school and actually be able to provide, okay. Absolutely. So I think it's really important that we keep this thing going where we're making sure that the principals are actually being involved with what they're doing. And then not only that, but getting that preparation early enough that it becomes something that becomes a meaningful part early on in their career.
Yeah.
And
I think it's really one of the most interesting points too to bring up is that we need to socialize these children at a young age where they are being included, or as well as give them a sense of independence rather than being very reliant on others. I think that was a really good point to bring up in the way that we teach these children.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really, I think, gets us great set up for the next question, where we're thinking about early intervention, right? And I think this is a key thing that is maybe misunderstood or not well understood enough around how important it is to get early intervention for students who may be struggling. And this is even before school age. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of early intervention?
Okay, so we have what's called PPCD screenings. And PPCD stands for Preschool Program for Children with Disability. Most of the time, this is an early intervention for students who are 3 to 5 years old. By 3 years old, this is very important that the parents keep up with doctor visits and things like that. The pediatrician, follows developmental milestones. And when those milestones are not met, then there's concerns. And so we have a wide range of 3-year-olds who have different abilities. Like there's some 3-year-olds that can tell me all their colors and numbers and shapes and things like that, which isn't expected until they're 6 or 5 in kindergarten.
Smarty pants.
Yeah, smarty
pants, right? And we have some 3-year-olds that are able to identify letters already. And I commend those parents that, work with these kids to get them prepared because, like I said, technology it's good and it's bad. And what I'm seeing is that technology is not supplementing or extending any lessons, it's taking over. And that's not the point of technology. And so when I do screenings and evaluations on students at 3, I look for those. And, the kids can't sit still. They can't attend a task and they can't generalize the skill. Yes, they can start matching on an iPad, but when you put blocks in front of them, can they do the same thing? No, they can't. And so that's why I want to warn parents, not a lot of technology before the age of 3. But speaking of, 3-year-olds, when we do assessments, we look at their language. Most of the time, it will be a language, a disability in their language. Receptive, expressive, pragmatic, and articulation. Majority of time, it's articulation. Right. And it's good to identify those deficits early on because language will impact how they access their education later on. There are studies out there that indicate that when a child has a language disability early on, it's a good indicator for dyslexia because they're having a difficult time producing these sounds. And if it's an auditory processing deficit, then they're not hearing it appropriately to be able to produce it appropriately. And that's the basis of dyslexia as well. And that's the basis of dyslexia as well. So
yeah. And I think there's something important in this that is not always really understood very well, maybe isn't even understood very well, but the importance of language acquisition for even forming thought. If a child is growing up and having difficulties with reading and difficulties with pronunciations and things like that, it is also creating a self-propagating problem where the kid is also having trouble creating and articulating new thoughts, because language is integrally connected to that, right?
Be able to communicate. Exactly.
Yeah. And so these things sort of play off of each other, among many other factors: family support, access to resources, and all of the sort of conglomeration of factors can make a huge difference, so that children even entering into kindergarten or first grade are coming with a huge set of variability in what they're able to do. You know, as you're saying, a kid that's, reading or doing basic math at 3 or 4 years old is going to get to school at 5 and be just light years ahead of their peers. And then teachers are sort of stuck with saying, well, is this comparison of this one brainy kid that came in with lots of support, and then this other kid who came in not knowing how to read anything at all? Is this a disability we're seeing, or is this just a natural difference in socialization and opportunity and availability of books and things like this that sort of are outside of the realm, at least, of thinking about how we understand disability as a comparison of capability?
Yeah. And, going back to what you had said at the beginning of the show, talking about how things that parents can take on from the show, what I do want to encourage is that, I understand that the world we live in now is full of technology. As adults, it's very hard for us to break away from technology as well. But for kids,
yeah.
But for kids, it's very important. And I know it's hard to bring your child to a restaurant without him tantruming, but let him tantrum, because what you should not do is put an iPad or a phone in front of them so that they can be quiet, but rather teach them appropriate ways to sit at a table and have conversations.
Right. And I think that's the difference between teaching and trying to go for a quick fix, right? And high expectations, along with patience and the knowledge that this is necessary to take the time for this, will get the kid to a place where they can handle new situations and can handle disruption. And I think a lot of times for parents, like, to take your example of sitting in a restaurant and the kid's throwing a tantrum, and it's like, well, I know I can put my phone in their hand and they'll be quiet instantly. And it's really embarrassing that I'm sitting in this restaurant and my kid is tantruming and everyone's looking at us. But the reality is, they're going to be looking at you for about 5 minutes, and then they're going to completely forget about everything that just happened. And you are essentially setting up a long-term, maybe even lifetime failure for your kid by not having that kind of patience and endurance and resilience to be embarrassed once in a while.
Yeah. And I mean, this carries on into education as well, because by the time those kids go into school, and that's why they're having those attention difficulties, because a teacher is not going to put an iPad in front of your face so that you are quiet. There's going to be emotional behavior concerns, the attention, the social skills, the listening skills. They're not used to it because their energy has been so focused on a device, and now they're expected to sit in a classroom with other kids and actually listen to someone talk. It's a difficult transition that they're not used to. No one's ever expected them to do it. And then parents are just like, I don't understand why they can't pay attention.
Right. And attention is not always a problem of medication and diagnosing ADHD. Sometimes attention is literally just not building up these habits where you're never expected to pay attention.
Right.
And if we never ask to do something, we're not going to be good at it. It doesn't matter how important it is or how much people expect us to do it. If we never actually have to do it, we're not getting the skills we need.
Exactly.
So go ahead.
I'm really interested, especially because like what you bring up through special education, and that it's more of a cure through social bits. It's interaction. It's not necessarily, let's give, like you're saying, give this child some medications to do better.
Right.
And so I guess, I mean, are you completely against the side of medication through, I guess, not as serious special education needs, or?
So I guss we're asking, what is your view on medicating children, and how does that come into play for you?
My personal view, I don't go straight to medication.
Sure.
In very serious situations, I think medication can alleviate some of the symptoms. I think that it's important for children and adults to have foundational skills, coping skills, strategies that they can carry on with them in life. Because the reality of the world is medication changes and our body becomes immune to it. And you're just upping chemicals that are being put into your body. Mm-hmm. And then at what point can you stop?
Right. And I've read this in terms of even adults getting prescribed, say, antidepressants.
Yeah.
You know, the responsible approach is you prescribe antidepressants for a short set amount of time and you go into, you know, psychotherapy or therapy or counseling or something like this. And the goal is to gain the skills you need to cope with life and cope with depression, not to use the pill as a permanent fix, because it does wear out. It does lose its efficacy and it becomes something that now instead of building tools to be independent, you are building a dependency on a chemical addiction.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Right. Okay. So we are literally so close to being out of time. I want to just fire some questions at you. Okay. First of all, if you are a principal or school leader listening right now, what are like the top 3 takeaways you might want to give, or top 2 things that you would want a principal in a leadership position at a school to know about dealing with students with disability?
I think it's very important that we actually step back, and I understand that there is a lot of stuff that you have to do and you just want to check things off of your list. But with special education, it's very important that these students receive, you know, appropriate programming that is individualized, instead of looking at, you know, what can I give for all the 4th graders? What can I give to all the 3rd graders? Now, at the same time, I understand that the campus is regulated by the district that they're in, and the district is regulated by the state that they're in. And so it's the principal is doing her part the best that she can. Funding is an issue. Staffing is an issue. I mean, everything boils down to funding.
Sure. But the school board is ultimately responsible for making sure all this stuff happens. And the school board appoints superintendents and event, you know, down the line principals, right? So at some level, we do need to actually hold school boards accountable if you're having trouble getting this principals or your school district to get in line with what your kid needs, right?
Yes, and I think that it's unfair for campuses to get dinged for things when it's actually the district should be, because the superintendent is making all those decisions, what the campus can and cannot do. And so I would also have very strong relationships with parents of students with disabilities, because it's a teamwork.
Yeah, absolutely.
And building relationship and building trust will only help the student to succeed, rather than, you know, us fighting against each other all the time.
Right.
And I think also principals should seek out more professional development, but also be involved in those professional development as well, because we can only lead by modeling what we want our teachers to do.
Yeah.
And so,
okay, I got to keep firing questions. We're almost out of time here. So what about parents listening right now who may need help advocating for their own kids? What are the maybe couple things that you would really urge parents to get informed about or seek help with, or find an advocate to help them make sure is happening correctly?
I think, going back, parents should really try to talk to the school first, build that relationship at the beginning, and work from there. But I also know that parents have a very strong push towards legislation rather than this campus. And in order for special education to change, the law has to change. And parents can do that. Parents can go to the lawmakers and voice their opinions. And I tell my parents all the time, you have a concern, we're limited. Go to the lawmakers and voice your concerns, demand change.
Right. Absolutely. And that's, I think, and it's funny you say that, because I think the majority of people who really become advocates for disability are parents or people that have disabilities themselves. And it's this understanding that they are being wronged, or that their children are being wronged, and that they want to fix that. And it creates, I think, some of the biggest and best change agents that we ever have in this domain. So it really is empowering and important to be empowered as a parent of a child with disability, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I got just a couple more. If you could, in 30 seconds, if you could wave a magic wand and just fix a few things in education, or special education in particular, what were the things you would fix?
The main thing I would fix is state assessments. And I think it's unfair that students who have modified curriculum and modified assignments and assessments be expected to take a state assessment where they are not able to have that. It's unfair for them. And it's unfair to the parents to keep getting these letters and calls that they did not pass it. And so I think the state assessment thing is the main issue.
Okay, well, a magic wand granted. If I could fix that, it would be done.
That
Okay,
would be great.
I'm just 100% behind that recommendation. Now, what is the best thing for you about helping and supporting students with disabilities?
I think watching those kids have success, and success is gauged differently. And I don't gauge it as, if they reach their goal, but we set high expectations for them. And if they make progress, that's what we want to look at. And so working with kids, working with special education, I love the fact that I'm able to advocate for them because I do have the background, I do have the passion for it. And I just love seeing families and parents and students just happy that the kids are making growth.
And what would be the hardest thing for you in this?
I think the hardest thing is the balance between what we are able to provide for students in the public school system. Sometimes I do know that the child would need XYZ, but it's not available in the public school system.
It must be heartbreaking, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's why I do have a lot of community resources and things like that I do provide.
Yeah. Well, your students and the parents that you work with are so lucky to have you in.
Sounds like
and
it, yes.
We are so lucky to have had you in the studio with us today to talk. This has been Ann Lay, and she is coming out to us from Texas to talk about special education with us here on Modern Education. Ann, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you so much.
It's been really a joy. Okay, so we are going to be signing off here. This is another episode of Modern Education on KZSU Stanford. We will be back next week, Fridays from 3 to 4 p.m. for your commute home. Up next is Scott Moulton with Party Time. Stick with us. Do not touch that dial. And we will be right back with a little bit of station business. I am excited to tell you about the World Turtle Trust. The World Turtle Trust is dedicated to protecting the world's population of sea turtles. They are currently engaged in funding research and conservation projects in Hawaii, Costa Rica, Indonesia, and Sierra Leone. You can support their efforts or find out how you can get involved by visiting world-turtle-trust.org. That's worldturtletrust.org, separated by dashes.
Here I have The Modern Architect with your host, Tom Dioro. Features interviews with renowned and cutting-edge architects and sustainability leaders. Tune in to KZSU Monday mornings at 10 to hear programs that explore the challenges, positive transformation, joy, and inspiration that architecture can bring to our cities, communities, and lives. Don't miss this locally produced radio show and podcast every Monday at 10 a.m. exclusively on KZSU, student-run radio for Stanford.
And I'm going to tell you about the Youth Movement Alzheimer's. The Youth Movement Against Alzheimer's promotes awareness and understanding of Alzheimer's disease by providing high school and college-age students with opportunities for volunteering, clinical research, and fundraising, with the ultimate goal of spreading compassion and empathy for those afflicted with the disease, and encouraging advocacy to do everything possible to ultimately find a cure. If you'd like to donate, visit theyouthmovement.org.